Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where this week we're talking about obsolescence. Now, if you're anything like us, you'll have seen dozens of types of tech become obsolete over your lifetime. The floppy disk, cassette tapes, the Nokia 5110. And the pace of change continues.
CDs aren't quite obsolete, but many computers no longer have a built-in drive, and their apparent replacements, USB sticks, are far less useful now thanks to the dominance of cloud than they were even 5 years ago.
But does tech ever really die? Or do its applications just become increasingly niche?
So, Jane, what do you think of when we talk about obsolete tech?
I think about word processors. So this is not word processing software. It's this little halfway house electronic device that there was between typewriters, I guess, and computers and word processing software as you think of it now, whether that's Docs or Word or Pages or take your pick, whatever else is out there. And I think that they are a truly obsolete tech because either you're going to use a typewriter because, I don't know, you're eccentric, or like most of us, you will be using word processing software and not even calling it that term, probably. So for me, that is and it's something that we used to have in my home, that is a piece of obsolete technology, absolutely.
Well, it's actually funny you should say that, because there's a couple of reasons why word processors aren't 100% obsolete.
You're joking.
No, I honestly... So, first example, George R.R. Martin, author of the widely popular Game of Thrones books, uses a computer that's completely disconnected from the internet in order to do his writing. Now, I don't know if he uses an actual old school word processing machine as opposed to just a computer that's left offline, but, I can entirely believe that. And also, there are now electronic typewriters.
Yes, I am familiar with those.
But like they're literal typewriter bodies with a little tiny LCD screen that literally don't do anything else, no other functions, but you type on them and then they save what you type into a text document. There's one called the FreeWrite, I believe. And the idea is for writers who find themselves getting distracted by emails or web browsing or Minesweeper or whatever, just to have something where they can write and it's a proper keyboard and it's digitally stored, but it is just writing. There is no way that you're going to get distracted by anything else. And like you say, it's a very, very niche use case, but still technically a word processing machine that is still in use.
I can't believe that I've been undone in our first question. Okay, what do you think? What do you think when we talk about obsolete technology?
Well, the first thing that comes into my mind when we talk about obsolete technology is actually, believe it or not, CDs.
Okay.
Because it is, to my mind, the worst form of physical media ever devised.
Okay.
Because as I'm sure we'll talk about later on in this episode, tape-based media, which most people think of when we talk about obsolete technology, i.e. cassette tapes for music or VHS for video, actually lasts a really, really long time. If you've got an original cassette tape or VHS from the kind of 70s or 80s when they were, first becoming popular, then chances are good, if you've got the hardware to play it, that it'll still work. Whereas if you've had a CD rattling around for, the last couple of years, there's an even chance that it will be completely unusable thanks to a couple of scratches.
Yeah, I mean, tape has its weaknesses. It stretches is one of the main problems, and it can get tangled as well. But yeah, tape, I'm the storage head on ITPro. But I remember when I first transferred to this beat and, people were talking to me about tape and I was like, have I gotten a time machine and come to this particular meeting? Because, it is a reliable, relatively durable form of technology. So obviously, you're not going to use it for what they call hot data. So stuff that you need to get at all the time. It's a form of cold storage, and it's still relatively common within the enterprise world. As I say, it's fairly durable. It does have its weaknesses. It can stretch. More than anything, it can get a bit flaky, and things can start to flake off of it. So you have to be careful and, back up your backups, all that kind of thing. But when it comes to that kind of magnetic storage versus other kinds of magnetic storage, it is less inclined to just kind of accidentally erase itself, which is a problem that you can have with other forms of storage. They're little, for want of a better way of putting it, their switches switch back and forward, and you have to tell them to all lie in a certain way, and tape tends to stick with the way that it has been told to lie, whereas other forms of magnetic media tend to just, after time, decide, actually, no, we're going to go back to the way we just were in the beginning. So yes, and it is one of those things that I was quite surprised when I moved on to the storage beat, just how common it is, and how much money it brings in for some of the enterprise storage providers as well.
And that's the thing about obsolete tech. The more quote unquote obsolete or outdated a piece of technology is, the more expensive it is going to be for those few individuals or companies or whatever that still want to use it, because the parts become scarcer and the technicians and vendors who can provide and service that equipment becomes rarer still, and therefore much more expensive. And I think a great example of this is actually fax machines, which most people would think of as being completely outdated, and nobody uses fax machines anymore, except they do.
Mm-hmm. It's an incredibly secure way in some ways of transmitting information, and it's quick and it's cheap. Okay, yeah, you've got to print it out or whatever, but
that was an excellent impression of a fax machine, I must say.
That's quite a good, dot matrix impression there. possibly aging myself a little, but it's harder to intercept than, say, an email, and also kind of who would bother and who has the nous to do it when you can interrupt lots of other electronic communications.
It's worth pointing out that a large portion of the NHS still uses fax machines on a regular basis, although there is a campaign ongoing kickstarted by Health Secretary Matt Hancock to replace those. But it was also, up until very, very recently, still used by the Premier League to conduct player transfers.
Yeah, presumably for the reasons just stated, that it's actually, you have to be in front of the fax machine in order to receive the transmission. So another kind of magnetic storage is floppy disks. So they were a feature of my life probably up until adolescence, really, and I'm sure many of our listeners have interacted with them for a very long time, from the sort of 8 1/4 inch through to 3 1/2 inch jobbies.
I remember delivering school reports on 3 1/4 inch floppies back in the day.
Yeah, well, I remember floppy disks. That's cool. Why I know why they are called floppy. So an obsolete.
Also, just as a sidebar, I find it really bizarre that there is an entire generation of computer users for whom they have only ever known a floppy as just the save icon. They've almost certainly never used an actual floppy disk and have no idea why the save icon looks the way it does.
Yes, actually, I'd never thought of that. Yeah, that is quite strange. So apart from the save icon, clearly an obsolete technology, no?
Well, you would think. But actually, there are still a lot of systems that rely on floppy disk inputs, such as the systems in aircraft, such as Boeing's 747 and 737 planes.
Yeah, which that's extraordinary in some ways when I found out about it. But they're a couple of decades old, these planes, and so of course they were made with the technology that was available at the time, that wasn't kind of massive or whatever. Yeah, several small discs to slot in and slot out. It seems ridiculous now, but at the time it's like, well, yeah, that this works. Why would it not work? I tell you somewhere else that's been around for a while that's using floppy disks, the International Space Station. For a similar but slightly different reason, it's a lot harder to do an IT hardware upgrade in space.
In space, no one can hear your ticket.
Yeah, indeed. But similar reason. Think about it. They're small. They're reliable, and and that will be the hardware just that was up there when the ISS went up into space. Also, the US Department of Defense's sort of nuclear control program, if you like, the way that they sent data between the field and the control centers was by floppy disk until roughly this time last year. So, yeah, I think that when you think of this, floppy disk, it is one of those things you're like, oh yeah, well, that's certainly in the bin. And as it turns out, very much not. There are these few critical use cases where I guess you've got to be really, really sure that the thing that you're going to transition to is right before you do it, because there's no coming back from that. If somebody does a hardware upgrade in my house, then the worst that can happen is, I don't know, my smart meter goes a bit haywire. But in these kinds of situations, it's proper life and death stuff, either for the inhabitants or, in the case of the DoD, the whole world, really.
Well, that's it for part 1, but we will see you after a short break.
Welcome back. Now, while we've taken a while speaking about hardware, is there anything on the software side of things that is obsolete or could be considered so?
Actually, surprisingly little. Most of the, if you like, original programming languages that were first cooked up in the 60s, 70s and 80s at the dawn of the computing boom are still in use in a lot of weird niche places. Much the same way as we've talked about with fax machines and floppy disks. Quite a lot of legacy systems that run on older languages, like, for example, COBOL, Fortran, C, even Unix in some places. There's an attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. A lot of these systems are very difficult to update. A lot of them are running really important mission critical applications. A lot of them are running in places that are maybe inaccessible from a kind of software updating perspective. And that means that you've had systems that are just happily chugging along with the same code that they've been running for 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah, I was going to say, is the attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, actually, pretty valid, considering that you run every risk of breaking it in trying to improve or making better or whatever it is, modernize, whatever your plan is. I think that, there are reasons to not do anything, just to leave it.
Absolutely. And, there's no guarantee that if you update say, your mainframe to run on, just to pull something out of the air, R or Python or Java or whatever, there's no guarantee that in another 10, 20 years you won't be facing the same problem with that language that you did with COBOL in terms of, a lack of support and being surpassed by other languages and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, is there a security element here as well? Much like how fax machines are actually quite a good way of transmitting sensitive information. If you have got a system that's running on a much older, more rarefied language, is it more likely that your average hacker, maybe not state-backed, but your average script kiddie or just somebody having a go, might be put off by the fact that they can't do anything exciting in there or possibly even see what's going on?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of that. I think it's almost security through obscurity in a way. I mean, if there's only a handful of actual developers and engineers that know the language that your mainframe runs on, then presumably there's an equally small, if not smaller, number of hackers and threat actors and whatnot that know it as well, which obviously makes it a lot more difficult to exploit. The more common languages, Java, JavaScript, PHP, all of that kind of stuff, it's a lot easier to exploit.
Yeah, for me, part of the issue though is that as the people who do know how to read and write these older languages retire or perhaps shuffle off this mortal coil, you end up with a sort of dead language, if you like. So there is also an element of either you really, really need to keep training people up, either internally or externally somehow, or you're going to need to make the transition.
Well, as we covered in a previous episode way back last year with Brad Mullard from Fujitsu Global, it can actually be really, really lucrative for developers, engineers, sysadmins who do put the time into learning these, so-called dead languages, because there is such a small amount of people that knows them. They can basically charge what they like in terms of the companies that actually need these systems maintained. So, I mean, much like, the few fax machine repair companies have basically cornered the market for the companies that still need fax machine servicing. If you are a freshly minted COBOL engineer, your job prospects are going to be pretty good.
So, do we think that there is any genuinely obsolete technology? Because we've covered a lot of stuff that we would think is obsolete and it's not. You pulled the rug out from under me right at the very beginning. Is there any genuinely obsolete tech? I do have one that I think is obsolete.
So I think that there are very few examples of genuinely obsolete technology, because particularly when it comes to enterprise technology, you will always find some pocket of the industry that is still using it in some fashion. It's usually, legacy systems, for want of a better word. It's usually stuff that has been running for decades and decades and hasn't been updated and is probably going to be shut down altogether before it actually is modernized. But I don't think really that there's any technology that is truly obsolete. I mean, even pagers are still in, not widespread use, but significant enough use in sectors like healthcare and hospitals and whatnot.
For good reason. With pagers, they can transmit through walls and floors and stuff in a way that other technologies can't without causing disruption to other electronic systems. There is a reason for it, as with everything we've spoken about so far. Is it obsolete? Oh no, there's this one use case that's actually kind of important that it has to be used for. I think you're probably right when it comes to enterprise technology, that there is something hanging around somewhere that has to perform this particular function. I think possibly in consumer, there's more examples. Ones that spring to my mind, I think I've talked about on the podcast before, the Minitel, which was like a little French kind of internet type thing. And I found one of those consoles at my mother-in-law's house. That was fun times. But
Does it still work?
Well, the system has been shut off within the past couple of years. But at the point that we found it, in theory, it would have still worked, yeah. But those are all now genuinely obsolete because the system was shut down centrally. The other things I can think of are like Laserdisc, which for all you young people out there is what I can only describe as a hybrid between a giant CD and a really bling vinyl record.
But you said there are still people who collect Laserdiscs.
Yeah, I guess, but they're not, new ones are not being created, are they?
Almost certainly not. Although, having said that, I wouldn't put it past them. There have been SNES and Mega Drive new cartridge games created in the last couple of years. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Well, if you are one of our listeners listening now who happens to know the answer of this, please do get in touch. I'd genuinely love to hear it. The other one that I can think of is Betamax. We've spoken about VHS, and that's the one that really grabbed the mass market for reasons that we can't talk about on a family show. Whereas Betamax, which despite being, by all accounts, better, just wasn't able to grab that foothold. But yeah, I think often, sort of most, even in this area, you get parts of old technology find their way into new technology. It's a constant sort of stepping stone, one to the other, the kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, if you like.
Well, I think that makes a rather fitting note on which to close out this week's episode. You can find links to everything we've discussed today in the show notes and even more on our website, itpro.co.uk. You
can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn, or send us an email where we are podcast@itpro.co.uk. Don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and if you like us, leave a rating or review to help other people find the show.
We'll be back next week for more insight into the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.